Maxymiser is the most powerful solution for optimizing the online customer experience through testing, personalization, and insights. Adam Corey is the Senior Director of Product at Tealium. In this role, he helps brands and technology companies break down data barriers to build more meaningful digital relationships with customers. He has over 15 years of experience in web and mobile analytics. Tealium is the leader in real-time unified marketing solutions, helping brands seamlessly integrate their siloed applications and data and drive more profitable interactions across all digital touchpoints. Reed Bryant is a data scientist at BrooksBell, the premier firm focused exclusively on enterprise-level testing, personalization, and optimization services. In this role, Reed uses advanced analytics and applied statistics to create data models, refine methodology, and generate deep insights from test results. Reed holds a Master of Science in Analytics degree from the Institute for Advanced Analytics at North Carolina State University. We encourage you to socialize during our webinar today. Please use the hashtag #personalize. As a reminder, this webinar will be recorded and sent out as a follow-up in the next few days. We'll use the last 5 minutes of our time today for Q&A, so if you have questions as we go along, put them in the chat and we'll try to cover them at the end. And with that, let's get started. Daniel, I'm going to hand you control of the mouse. So take it away, Daniel.
Great, and thanks. And thank you all for joining today's webinar. I'll spend a few minutes first describing the general trend toward personalization, then talking about the different flavors of personalization, including the levers that a marketer can use to pick their flavor. And lastly, I'll review a high-level plan for how an organization who is not yet doing personalization can get there, and how those who are already doing it can take their program to the next level. Just a few years back, marketers across the US began using A/B and multivariate testing as an empirical, data-driven way of making site design decisions. When working with clients in designing their optimization roadmaps, we'd use funnel analysis to determine where on the site we would run a test, then create a number of design options for our A/B test, and finally run a test to identify which option drove the highest conversion rate among our visitor base in its entirety. In other words, we were looking for the variant of our A/B test that is the winner for all visitors. Fast forward slightly, and the approach just described has been augmented with a customer-centric approach to determining the perfect digital experience for visitors to our respective sites. We do this by thinking about our different visitor groups first and selecting the group that represents the greatest immediate opportunity for improvement, then designing multiple design options based on hypotheses about this specific group of visitors, and ultimately discovering the optimal experience for that group. And there's a reason this shift is so important. With campaign-centric testing, we successfully drive a higher conversion rate, but oftentimes this will have little to no effect on long-term customer loyalty and growing customer lifetime value. While the customer-centric approach, also known as personalization, can have an incredible impact not only on conversion rates today, but also on the overall loyalty and average lifetime value of our respective visitor groups. And just to flesh this out a bit, when we describe the areas of your visitor experience that will drive overall lifetime value, the opportunity lies in 3 elements with your digital experience primarily. 1, the banners and offers across your digital experience, making sure each visitor sees the offers that are most relevant to him or her. 2, the product and merchandising of your site, making sure the product you show a visitor is tailored to his or her preferences. And 3, layout and journey, making sure that it's as simple as possible for each visitor to do the things they want to do when coming to your site. This culminates in a fully optimized visitor experience whereby through a series of both campaign-centric and customer-centric initiatives, Your digital experience is holistic and relevant to each group in its entirety. The challenge is, when we start to get tactical and actually apply some of this, personalization campaigns can be set up in many ways. So what I've tried to do is distill it down to two levers. The first lever is the amount of information we have about each visitor. This data is often described in terms of visitor attributes. For example, gender is male or female. Product affinity is women's dresses or men's suits. Loyalty tier is high, medium, low. Each of these data points is an attribute, and the more attributes we have access to, the more we know about each visitor, and the more precise we can be in delivering the best digital experience for each visitor. And second, the number of experiences or design options. We're moving from having one version of our site to having more than one, so that we can show each visitor the best site for them. This means we have to actually have multiple versions of the various elements that make up our site. So multiple offers, images, layouts, and categories of product to recommend. Now there is such thing as too many versions, because you'll start to lose meaningfulness when one version isn't really that different from another. But having more than one version of your digital experience is important to ultimately being able to serve different visitors, each with their optimal experience. And the goal is this: taking those data points or attributes from all your channels to build a 360-degree view of each of your visitors, and ultimately delivering the most relevant and contextual digital experience to each visitor across all channels. Lastly, I'd like to emphasize that this is not easy, and it cannot be done in a minute. For anybody just starting to adopt a test and learn culture, I'd suggest starting out with basic A/B testing to identify the best design in total, and evolving to personalization, where you're showing different visitors different experiences, and ultimately doing this using your visitor data from all sources in order to deliver a seamless and optimized experience across all touch points. We'll be going into each of these concepts in a bit more detail over the next few minutes, and I'd be more than happy to answer any questions on what I've presented toward the end of this webinar. With that, I'll pass it over to Adam. Thank you.
Great, and thank you so much, Dan. All right. Excellent. So while we get started, I thought it might make sense to talk for a few minutes about the evolving concept of personalization. You know, in today's day and age, I think we've seen a big shift in the way that all of us interact with devices and the way that we interact with the brands through those devices. What I want now in terms of what I'm browsing, what my interests are, what products I'm interested in being targeted at, all of these things are very specific to what moment I'm in and that particular experience that I'm trying to create in that moment. I think a few years ago we would have thought about how millennials are interacting with technology and how that was maybe a point in time and they might start to adapt to the way that they use technology similar to others in older generations. But what we've seen is that older generations are now adopting a lot of the millennial kind of trademarks in that they device switch quite a bit. They interact across in-store and in-person and social in a very fluid manner. And all of these things, no matter how I'm interacting, are really creating pieces of data about me. So all of these individual pieces of data, whether it's on my desktop, whether it's in-store, on my iPad, or over the phone, all of these things are tracking my behavior and helping to complete the piece of the puzzle about who I am as a consumer and how I feel about a particular brand and what my interests are in that moment. And as data is being created there, it's also creating an opportunity for what we call atmospheric marketing, which is leveraging that data and the devices that I'm using to build meaningful customer relationships regardless of how I'm choosing to interact. So whether it's computers, smartphone, in-store, tablets, or other pieces of data, all of these things are creating opportunities for me to engage consumers with more information and personalize an experience that's designed for them. But for us as marketers, acting on this data can be a bit difficult. We have a few different things going on inside of our organizations that puts data in different silos. We have our email marketers, which work with a bit of data, and they're trying to personalize and create a great experience via email. They're also gathering data. Same thing's happening on our web properties. Data's being gathered, experiences being personalized there. So we have lots of different, what we call islands of insights, sitting across different technologies and across different parts of the organization. But then, of course, outside of our organizations, customers are continuing to change the game. Whether it's through different devices or different technologies, there's just an explosion of different places where this data is being generated. If we think back, you know, as Kelly mentioned earlier in the call, I've been in the space for about 15 years. Back at the 2000 era, there were a handful of digital marketing technologies that were out there, what I'm kind of calling tag-based technologies, things that you would implement on your site. Today, there are thousands of these technologies. All have great ability to personalize the experience, grow the data that I know about somebody and help me advertise and engage them. But each of these are actually creating their own little snippets of information and little pieces of a profile about what I know. And unfortunately, not all of these technologies are talking to one another. And inside of our marketing organizations, not all of us are talking to one another about the insights that we're gaining from each one of these solutions. And as I mentioned, it's not just inside of our organization that there are challenges. Outside, our consumers are creating more challenges for us. There was a study that came out of the UK last year that found that people at home are actually swapping devices an average of 21 times per hour in the evening. And that seems like a really large number, but when you think about it for a moment and think about what you did probably last night while you had your work laptop open and your phone and maybe your iPad going while you're watching TV, you're most certainly switching devices many different times. And what you're doing is you're leaving a little bit of a piece of information across every single device. And if the brands that you're interacting with and the retail sites that you're interacting with don't stitch those together to have a good understanding of who you are, it becomes a bit of a challenge. At the same time, the purpose of some of these channels that we once interacted or once treated as a marketing channel have evolved quite a bit. We've seen this with our customers here where things like Twitter, which at one point was a social media and marketing channel, has now turned into support and even a concierge experience for the brands. So it's really just changed the way that brands are interacting with different devices and technologies based on the way that consumers' behaviors are changing. But as I mentioned, with these thousands of different technologies, each creating a different profile, what's needed here is the ability to bring together a universal view of who somebody is so that I can truly personalize the experience regardless of what channel or technology they're using to interact with my brand. And for this, what we at Tealium call the data supply chain is the start of the answer to this. We all typically think about how I can get a universal view of the customer and how I can better understand who someone is across devices. But really, when you think about it, it's an entire data supply chain that starts from the interactions that customers are doing on your site and in your mobile applications, then bringing into the thousands of technology vendors, into any of the analytics and data warehouse environments that you may have to then learn more and mine that data and work with it to create a truly holistic view of a customer, regardless of where somebody is. And so we'll talk a bit about what this is in action. The concept sometimes of a data supply chain can seem a bit daunting for a lot of folks out there, but I'm going to give you an example of one of our retail customers and what they're doing as some of their initial steps in this world, and also leave you with some guiding ideas on how to take some of this and act on it in your own organization. So I'll start off with American Eagle Outfitters. So American Eagle Outfitter, you probably know as a retailer across the country, both online and stores throughout the country. What they wanted to do was look at the fact that consumers, and they do work a lot with millennial customers as well as broader age demographics, but they wanted to connect what they knew about people from their online behavior with their in-store action. So if somebody was browsing and showed some interest in particular items online, they wanted to bring that behavior in store so that if they didn't convert online and they did choose to go in store, that they were able to have a seamless customer experience and encourage conversion, but also encourage cross-sell and upsell activities whenever appropriate. So for them, what they did was take advantage of the data that's generated as people are going to an American Eagle online property, what products they're browsing, what things they're comparing product-wise against one another, sizes, other attributes about a product. and they're actually sending this information and passing it along to this universal profile as part of the data supply chain, and becoming a part of this universal profile for that user, so that if that user decides to become a real person and go into a store, then they can actually see the products that were relevant to them based on their online behavior, and they're actually displayed for them right at the point of sale system. So as they're actually interacting with a cashier or an in-store associate, they're actually able to talk about what was happening online and potentially introduce them to relevant products or remind them of things that they saw online. And this is really a pretty compelling example of testing new campaigns and really personalizing the experience, not just in the digital channel, where a lot of us have started to dabble with presenting the right product and merchandising based on customer behavior, but bringing it into the physical realm. And for American Eagle Outfitters, this is something that they're certainly breaking new ground. And I think to be able to break new ground and innovate really requires a different mindset. So from that, we'd like to take a couple items here to talk about where to begin with this. I think the first one is quite interesting, certainly coming from a vendor as well, to think about what you'd like to do in a vendor-neutral fashion. We start this by talking about shutting your laptop for a moment, not right now because you're on a webinar, but shutting your laptop for a moment with your teams and talking about what you can know or what you should know about your customers, regardless of a particular channel or technology that you use. What is it that customers are doing? They're browsing products, they're comparing products to one another. If you're a clothing retailer, they're likely putting together an outfit. They might be looking at several different products. They're doing something based on their online behavior that's sharing something about their interests. Vendors and technologies will help you get there, but no vendor or technology is going to know your business better than you will. So it's important to take a step back away for a moment from the different technologies that you use. Think about your business and think about the ways that you can interact with your customers and come back to your vendors and technology. This is also great as a vendor speaking here. It's great because we get to see our customers innovate and come up with brand new ways to apply our technologies to their business that we as a vendor might never have thought of out of the gate. The next is to look at the concept of a data supply chain. We have lots of great content on this at Tealium.com where you can learn about ways to build this data supply chain. But it all starts from understanding what data you know about somebody as they're browsing a site, and that really becomes the data layer. Things that you understand about what they're clicking on, attributes. It's important to identify what you know and also what you don't know. Are there any areas of your site or your customer experience that are currently data blind spots that maybe you can connect together? So similar to what we talked about with American Eagle, connecting to online to offline previously could have been a blind spot. Identifying it as an organization and determining where data needs to exist allows you to work cross-functionally. And finally, inside of an organization, we like to call one of the opportunities that you have to work with your colleagues the ability to make friends with data. Since all the different parts of your organization and even in your marketing team might have different pieces of the puzzle that help understand who a particular consumer is, it's helpful to work together to create this universal understanding of who somebody is. And if you can make friends with other parts of your organization with data and working together with what you know about a consumer, you can create a much more holistic experience for that consumer. And this allows you to really get buy-in, not just above you, but around you in your organization, what we call a 360-degree buy-in to your customer initiatives. And now I'm going to pause and turn it over to Reed Bryant from Brooks Bell to continue our discussion.
Thanks, Dan and Adam. We appreciate that information. It's very helpful, and it will illuminate what we'll cover in this part of the webinar. So here at Brooks Bell, we've surveyed over 300 companies, and from those surveys, we realized that 49% of those companies aren't personalizing. So with all the information we've heard today and all the benefits of personalization, the question remains, why aren't more companies jumping in? And we feel that it's because most companies fail to see the actual incremental path to success, the path that can be successfully implemented and the path that can actually prove profitable. So if we take a second and look at the landscape of personalization, we feel that personalization can fall into one of three buckets. And those three buckets closely mimic the classic trichotomy of problems. So problems and their respective solutions can either be easy, hard, or impossible. So from a personalization perspective, one-to-most is an example of an easy personalization solution, but it's not effective. And it's not effective because the one-to-most approach is kind of a simple segmentation approach, loyalty customer or not, by gender, by device type, so on and so forth. And that really doesn't get down to a granular enough piece of information to allow the marketers to offer a subset of relevant products to those individuals. So one-to-few is an example of a hard approach to personalization, but like most hard problems, their solutions are actually valuable to the organizations that can achieve success. So we'll spend most of the webinar focusing on this one-to-few approach, which is where we believe the profit lies. And I'd like to quickly contrast that with one-to-one. I know this might be slightly controversial, but we feel that one-to-one personalization falls in the impossible bucket, and at the very least is idealistic. And we say that because there are an infinite number of total possible visitors that come to each company's website. And really the approach of modeling and personalization is to match each customer to a finite number of experiences. So for one-to-one, really to be one-to-one, you'd have to match an infinite number of visitors to an infinite number of experiences. And we know, everyone on this call knows that that is really infeasible from every possible perspective. So with that, we'd like to focus in on that one-to-few approach. And that's the approach that we believe can prove profitable. And we say that because one-to-few allows the actual personalization to be narrow enough to drive engagement, but actually broad enough to be implemented profitably. So from a strategic perspective, from a very qualitative perspective, if you're looking at the different groups you have and the different groups you have the ability to personalize, we really kind of like to walk through what we call the 5 essential elements of personalization. So this acronym that spells out ADAMS has been floating around for some time, and we feel that if you can answer each one of these criteria successfully in terms of profitability perspective, you can actually achieve this one-to-few this personalization opportunity from a profitable perspective. So with that, the first key is accessible. Is it actually possible to reach each group efficiently? And in the digital space, we traditionally don't see this too much as an actual issue, but the question of contextualization comes in. So not only is it a question of can we reach them in a time and place where the recipient of the message will be incentivized to act. Second is differential. Are the groups actually unique? And you can determine this is by trying to determine, asking yourself a simple question, would the groups actually respond differently if you presented them with a different campaign? And if the answer to that is no, you probably shouldn't spend your time and your dollars personalizing to that specific group. Third is actionable. This may seem obvious, but you actually need to have a product to fit the specific needs of each group that you've identified. And just as a brief example of that, if you're an outdoor retailer and you've identified a group of people who only purchase winter outdoor gear, and you're in the middle of summer, and those folks don't have the propensity to purchase over the summer, you obviously wouldn't spend your time personalizing to that particular group over the summer. You would wait and run that campaign when it's more seasonally appropriate. Measurable. Can the impact of personalization actually be quantified? And this is important for 2 reasons. So I'll take a second to walk through this in a little bit more detail. First, it's from a risk mitigation standpoint. If you can actually run a test on the personalization efforts, you can show a percentage of your traffic, the personalized experience, and the other percentage of the traffic, the actual control experience. And from a risk mitigation standpoint, while you're trying to understand the impacts of personalization and your ability to actually change behavior online, you don't want to roll that out to 100% of the traffic right at first. And second, from a perspective of actually being able to prove ROI, you again want to split the traffic, run a portion to the personalized experience and a portion to the control, so you can actually measure the lift, hopefully the positive lift over the control for that personalized, more relevant experience. And I think everyone on the call today realizes the importance of budgetary constraints. So when you're running these high-level personalization campaigns, you actually want to be able to, from a true experimentation perspective, be able to quantify the results and prove that ROI. And lastly is substantial. So this is, are the groups large enough or are they valuable enough to warrant the expense of personalization? So this can be achieved, from a simple cost-benefit analysis. Essentially, you just want to make sure that the benefits, the lift you're getting in revenue, exceeds the cost of running that campaign. And the costs are, as the host mentioned earlier, it's actually the additional creative copies that you're making for the different experiences, and the implementation costs of rolling those different experiences out to different people on your site. So those are the 5 essential elements of personalization: accessible, differential, actionable, measurable, and substantial. And now I'd like to walk into a more data-intensive part. So this is for all the math elites, all my fellow data nerds on the call. So you may be asking yourself, okay, so from a business strategy standpoint, I have these groups, and I can determine which ones I should personalize at one specific time. But the question remains, how do I actually form the number of groups, and how do I classify any one person into any one specific group? So this is where the analytics and the data science comes in. And one approach among many is an approach called clustering. It's an unsupervised learning technique. And really what it's attempting to do is create broad, stable groups of like-minded users. So you're not trying to predict any specific action. You're not trying to predict if a person will buy or not. You're trying to study all your users and find the underlying structure in the data. And clustering will group users together in a way, mathematically optimal way, to maximize the similarity of members of the same cluster, while at the same time also maximizing the difference of members of opposing clusters. And the last nice thing about clustering or any of these types of more advanced personalization techniques is that it will actually leverage all the data that you have. So, it will take advantage of in-store online data. Really, whatever you throw at the algorithm, it will determine what's the most important variables and will split based on those variables. So if we quickly contrast that to what I'll call old school segmentation, which I would bucket into this one to most personalization approach. If we contrast it here, we see in the background of this diagram, this is actually the result of a cluster analysis. So like I said, it leverages 10, 20, 100 variables, and it groups people based on what's most important to that specific group. And if an analyst wanted to come in and actually do a basic segmentation model, they may arbitrarily decide, or based on a limited amount of data, that gender and maybe perhaps device type are the 2 most important items to personalize on. And if that was their decision, these 4 groups would be the actual result of that solution. So if you overlay that on top of the cluster analysis, you can see that 2 things are happening. One, you're not classifying people as granular as you should, and also you have the ability to misclassify people, send people to the wrong experience. So if we want to compare that to clustering, which is the one-to-few approach, which is the approach we are actually advocating, clustering will pull from those many variables the actual most important variables to that specific group. So perhaps this group, the most important thing is they browse predominantly genes-related products. In this group in the middle, maybe the most important variable is that they're always shopping and purchasing from a mobile device. And that's important because we ultimately want to hand off this analysis to the marketers so they can actually take it and make it actionable. So in this instance, perhaps we've identified this cluster as a group of male seasonal shoppers. So 1, they are predominantly shopping for male-related products, and 2, they're shopping about once a quarter. So with that information, you can hand that off to the marketers, and they'll develop campaigns that will target that group appropriately. So in this instance, breaking out the seasonal apparel. If we contrast that to a second cluster, for instance, female new arrival shoppers, maybe this cluster differs. Maybe they're perhaps looking predominantly at female-related products. Instead of shopping once a quarter, they're almost continually on the site. And perhaps they're actually only looking at the new arrival products, or looking at that in a larger propensity. So from that, the marketers would derive messaging around exclusivity and actual new products in hopes to actually engage the audience to drive that personalization. So of course, when you're working into this one-to-few personalization approach, it's, like I said up front, it's a hard problem. But it's valuable. So with any hard problem, you're going to run into a couple hurdles. And we feel the two main hurdles are getting the data and then doing something with the data. So getting the data is becoming easier. With companies like Tealium and Maxymiser, they're actually supplying the tools from a vendor perspective to allow us to access information and access it in a way that we can target on it in real time. But in terms of what data we need, we can pull that from those tools, and we can bucket that into behavioral data. So what people are doing when they come to the site. So what categories they're viewing, what product types they're viewing, so on and so forth. Are they adding things to their cart? Are they actually converting? We can combine that with customer profile data. So, who is that customer within the four walls of that company? Have they purchased in-store? Have they purchased online? Their basic demographic information, age, gender, geolocation. And lastly, if we combine that with third-party data, so that represents data outside of the four walls of the company. This is data you can purchase from a data vendor, which would perhaps enrich your cluster analysis and allow you to personalize even better. If you have that, you obviously want to leverage that. And lastly, brain power. So you want to have the ability to actually execute on these campaigns. And going forward, as the vendors in the marketing space continue to add on additional features, a lot of this will be able to be done in the tool specifically. But up front, we found it beneficial to actually pull the data out, analyze it ourselves, and then import the rules back into the tool. But you need to have the specific skill set to do that. So if you're talking to an analyst or you're speaking to an agency, you want to ask specific questions such as, are you familiar with unsupervised learning techniques such as clustering? And if they look at you like you're speaking a foreign language, it's probably best to find another analyst or agency to speak to. And lastly, I'd like to leave you with a couple of steps to profitable personalization. So one is about the data. So it's meeting with the analyst team to determine what kind of data you have and making sure that that data you have is actionable so you can target customers on it immediately and in a timely fashion when they arrive on your site. Second is meeting with the marketing and the dev teams to understand constraints. So the cluster analysis may have maybe 10 clusters, for example, but if marketing and creative only has the capacity to create 3 for any given campaign, you want to understand that constraint and pass that along to the analyst team. And so that kind of leads us into number 3, is developing that actual analytics framework. So taking the constraints, packaging the information, and delivering that to the analyst so they can create the appropriate solution. At that point, you as the marketer sit back and let the analysts do their thing. They'll come up with the cluster analysis and actual rules that will be used to classify any individual into one of those particular groups. And lastly is implementation. So as I spoke to earlier, as we're walking into these more advanced personalization type campaigns, it's really important to do it from an experimentation perspective. So 1, you can mitigate risk, and 2, you can actually prove that ROI. So really that is focused on testing, measuring, iterating, and optimizing the performance.
Great. Thank you, Reed, for giving us that overview of the keys to making personalization profitable. Hopefully listeners can use those actionable steps to get started today. With that, we'll go ahead and do some Q&A. We have a few questions here. The first question will go to Dan. So Dan, could you please provide a little bit of detail into how similarities and differences are defined for the purposes of clustering?
Yeah, and I'd invite Reed to chime in on this one because he's actually presented the notion of clustering, which I think is a really good one. And I agree with Reed that one-to-one personalization is a bit pie in the sky. It's almost unobtainable. There are ways that you can move toward that on the spectrum, but it's a little bit far-fetched. But in terms of clustering, it's really about finding the attributes, the meaningful attributes of visitors that kind of are common among different groups. So he gave a great example of not just segmenting by a couple of attributes, but adding I forgot the specific attribute, but maybe it was device type or something like that, which was a third attribute that was meaningful in that particular case, and added some meaningful similarities between those visitors. And the ultimate objective really is to find visitors with similar preferences, similar tastes. So different groups of visitors could have similar tastes, but if visitors with a number of different attributes that seem kind of randomly associated with each other happen to make up the profile of a visitor who prefers one offer or one layout versus another, from my perspective, that's the similarity that we're looking for. It's driven by their preference for one experience over another.
Yeah, Dan, this is Reed. I think that answer was spot on. I don't have too much to add. From the specific the clustering perspective specifically, the algorithm will go in, and it's a little bit of an abstract concept if you actually haven't been presented with this information ahead of time. But each variable is its own dimension. So from a multidimensional space, it's trying to determine what variables, what attributes are actually important to defining any one given group. So, and it's done in two ways. One, it's maximizing the similarity in the actual group while maximizing the difference between other groups. So if, just a concrete example is if your entire visitor population predominantly shopped on desktop, for instance, and you had one group that actually wasn't different from the others in any way other than their device type, that cluster would be formed around the actual difference that was highlighted. So it would be formed around device type, and that really lets the analyst take the numbers from analyzing the cluster analysis and develop a more of a narrative story to hand off to the marketing team for purposes of targeted and relevant messaging.
Thanks for that, guys. Adam, this next question will go to you. How can you stitch together data from single user that logs on from different devices without a login?
Great. Thank you for that. And that's a great question. So to give everyone a little bit of context, with Tealium, we don't take an either-or approach when it comes to IDs that you may have about a consumer. It's kind of a yes and or a multi-approach. So in many cases, you might have an authenticated experience, a login, a purchase, a loyalty program, a social logon. You might have different things that are helping you to understand who somebody is and tie that to either an in-store or another device. In other cases, maybe up the funnel a bit before you've had that first conversion or before you've gotten someone to connect or sign up for your loyalty program, you might have had them click through from an email that they opted into. And emails can come with a unique identifier or subscriber key that can allow us to stitch together an understanding of who somebody is across multiple devices. We've also seen a lot of success, again, even higher up the funnel than that, at customers using things like saving links to their cart, having a feature that saves that or sends it to their phone or sends it to a device. And that allows a kind of a cross-device understanding of who a person is, even if they haven't yet gone further to actually authenticate. If you're all the way up the funnel and someone maybe has a very new relationship with you, or they have a brand new device that they haven't yet gone down the funnel on, then at that point you're really focused on single channel personalization. And then as soon as that crossover event happens, they click through an email, they register, they have their loyalty log on, whatever it is there. At that time that there's that crossover event, at that point we'll actually stitch together those activities that happened on the new iPad as well and stitch it together with their entire view. And it's important to note that when we talk about stitching, it's not just linking the two devices together, but understanding if that user who was on the iPad and browsed 15 different products and maybe exhibited some new behaviors that you might want to act on, that's actually stitched together to the holistic view of who Kelly, for example, is. So great question.
Thanks for that, Adam. Reed will have our next question. So Reed, what should I look for when hiring an analyst with personalization in mind?
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. That is a very good question. So I think it boils down to two things. One, technical skills, and two, the soft skills to actually be able to sell your solution and have it be implemented. So one, from a technical side, you need to have someone conducting the search for that talent that actually has some level of familiarity with analytics or data science. So if you're trying to kind of run the campaign in the approach I presented, which involves downloading the raw user-by-user data, analyzing the results, and exporting the rules, you need to actually have someone with the technical skills to do that. So again, it's asking specific questions and gauging responses around techniques such as unsupervised learning, explaining the difference between different techniques and alternatives, and really kind of boiling the questions down to how have you leveraged these techniques in the past, and have you had success with these techniques in prior engagements. And the second component is the soft skills. So, traditionally there's a continuum. The better you are at the technical hard skills, the worse you are in business or applied settings. So you really need to find someone that has the balance between those technical skills and the soft skills. If you can't explain the concept in a way that's accessible to other individuals within your organization, you're not going to really meet with any degree of success in getting your personalization solutions rolled out.
Great. Well, thanks to our speakers, Dan, Adam, and Reed. Before we sign off today, I'd like to thank both Maxymiser and Tealium for being our presenting sponsor and dinner sponsor, respectively, at Click Summit this year. Click Summit is a premier testing and optimization event. Unfortunately, we're sold out of tickets this year, but you can join the waiting list at the link shown on the screen. Thank you for joining us today. We hope you will take what you've learned to create a practical and profitable